The red laser traced across the marble balcony of a Manhattan penthouse like a whisper from hell. 42 floors up, the city glittered below in a river of gold and diamond light. Dante Ferrari, the most feared crime boss on the eastern seaboard, sipped his bourbon and stared out at his kingdom, entirely unaware that a professional sniper had just settled crosshairs on the base of his skull. He had 3 seconds left to live. Nora Whitfield, the plus-sized trauma nurse who had only come to check on his ailing grandmother, spotted the crimson pinpoint dancing across his crisp white collar through the glass doors. She had no time to scream, no time to think, no time to weigh consequences. She launched her full frame across 10 feet of imported Italian marble and slammed into him just as the reinforced glass wall behind him detonated into 1,000 glittering shards. 3 of her ribs snapped on impact with a sickening clarity of dry branches breaking. His bourbon glass exploded against the stone railing. And when Dante Ferrari opened his eyes to find a curvy stranger bleeding on top of him, a woman who had traded her own bones for his life, the entire underworld was about to shift on its axis. Because nobody, not even his own blood, had ever taken a bullet for him before. If you're already hooked on this story, smash that like button, subscribe for more mafia romance stories, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments below. 6 hours earlier, Nora Whitfield had no idea her Tuesday evening would end with a bullet grazing her hairline. She stood in front of the tall gilded elevator of a private Upper East Side residence, smoothing the front of her navy blue scrubs and adjusting the small silver stethoscope charm that hung on a delicate chain around her neck. It had belonged to her father, a retired Marine combat medic who had drilled situational awareness into her the way other fathers taught their daughters to ride bicycles. Notice the exits. Notice the hands. Notice the eyes. Notice everything. Nora was 31 years old, plus size, and carried her generous curves with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had long ago stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. Her dark hair was pulled into a low, neat bun at the nape of her neck. Her lips wore a soft berry stain. She had 8 years of trauma nursing at Mount Sinai stitched into her steady hands, and the private duty agency had booked her for a straightforward job, an 82-year-old post-surgical patient recovering from a hip replacement. Simple, routine, the kind of job Nora could do in her sleep. The agency had told her almost nothing about the family, just the name Ferrari and a note that discretion was expected. Nora had assumed old money. She had not assumed old blood. When the elevator doors slid silently open on the top floor, she stepped into a private foyer that felt more like the entrance to a European palace than a Manhattan apartment. Cream marble floors veined with gold. A crystal chandelier the size of a small car. Fresh white roses in tall onyx vases. And 2 enormous men in matte black suits standing at the doorway with the still, watchful stillness of soldiers rather than servants. One of them extended a hand for her medical bag without a word, checked it with polite efficiency, and returned it. The other simply nodded and opened the heavy walnut doors. Nora walked inside with her chin lifted and her expression professional. Whatever this family was, she was here to do her job. Isabella Ferrari was waiting in a sunlit rear sitting room that had been converted into a temporary recovery suite. She was small and silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wrapped in a soft cashmere shawl, and she brightened the moment Nora walked through the door. "Ah, finally," the old woman said in lightly accented English, patting the chair beside her. A woman with real shoulders. The last nurse looked like she would break if I sneezed on her. "Come, sit. Tell me your name." Nora smiled, warmth spreading through her chest despite herself. "Nora Whitfield, ma'am. And I promise you, I do not break easily." Isabella laughed, a bright papery sound, and immediately began chattering as Nora took her vitals. Blood pressure steady, pulse strong, incision site healing cleanly. Nora adjusted the dosage schedule on her pain medication, gently corrected the position of a pillow that was pressing against the surgical site, and spent a full 20 minutes simply listening to Isabella talk about her late husband, her rose garden in the Hamptons, and her grandson, whom she referred to only as my Dante. Nora felt the old woman's loneliness like a physical weight. She had seen it 100 times before, wealthy patients surrounded by staff and starved for actual human contact. So she stayed longer than the appointment required. She held Isabella's hand. She laughed at her jokes. She was so absorbed in the conversation that she did not notice the moment the temperature in the penthouse dropped by 10 degrees. She did not notice the guard straightening at the doorway. She did not notice the silence that had swept through the entire residence like a held breath. She only noticed the man when his shadow fell across the sunroom floor. Nora looked up slowly, her hand still resting gently on Isabella's wrist as she finished counting the old woman's pulse. And then she forgot how to breathe. The man standing in the doorway of the sunroom did not so much enter a space as absorb it. He was tall, easily 6'3", with the kind of broad, powerful shoulders that filled the entire frame of the doorway. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled precisely to his forearms, exposing corded muscle, and the faint pale trace of an old scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. His trousers were charcoal, tailored by someone who understood the geometry of a dangerous body. His jaw was carved granite. His dark hair was swept back from a widow's peak. And his eyes, when they finally settled on her, were the color of wet obsidian, entirely devoid of warmth, cataloging her the way a butcher catalogs meat. Nora had spent 8 years in Bronx emergency rooms. She had held down gang enforcers while surgeons dug bullets out of their thighs. She had looked into the eyes of contract killers bleeding out on gurneys. She knew, with the immediate certainty of a woman who had learned to read violence on sight, exactly what kind of man was standing in front of her. This was not old money. This was old blood. "Na," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate through the marble floor. "Come stay." Isabella's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Dante mio caro, come and meet Nora. She is wonderful. She listens to me, not like the last one, who kept looking at her phone." Dante Ferrari crossed the room in 3 unhurried strides. He bent down, pressed a slow, reverent kiss to his grandmother's silver hair, and murmured something to her in Italian that was so tender it made Nora's throat tighten unexpectedly. Then he straightened, and the tenderness evaporated. He did not look at Nora. He looked past her, at the medical bag on the side table, at the exit doors, at the security guards in the hallway. Then he spoke again in Italian, quietly to his grandmother, as if Nora were a piece of furniture whose feelings could not possibly be relevant. "Nana, ci è questa donna grossa, che assai gira per casa mia? Ci lo ha permesso di entrare." Which translated, with brutal precision, to, "Grandmother, who is this large woman waddling around my house? Who let her in?" Nora did not react. She did not flinch. She did not even blink. She simply finished counting Isabella's pulse, wrote the reading down in her chart with a steady hand, and closed the folder. She had spent a semester abroad in Florence during her linguistics minor at Columbia before she had switched to nursing, and she had spent the 4 years afterward keeping up her fluency by watching Italian cinema on quiet Sunday afternoons. She understood every syllable of what Dante Ferrari had just said about her body, and she was going to make him wish he had chosen his native tongue more carefully. She stood up slowly. She smoothed the front of her scrubs. She turned to face Dante with the same calm, unbothered expression she wore when she was about to inform a family that their loved one had not made it out of surgery. And then she spoke, in flawless, elegant, Florentine Italian. "La donna grossa," Nora said, her voice smooth as poured cream. "Stie tenendo, in vita, tua. Forse mostra un po' di gratitudine prima di insultar l'umani che stanno richiusendo la tua famiglia." The large woman is keeping your grandmother alive. Perhaps show a little gratitude before you insult the hands stitching your family back together. The silence that followed was so complete that Nora could hear the faint tick of the antique clock in the hallway. Isabella Ferrari let out a sharp, delighted cackle and clapped her weathered hands together like a woman watching her favorite opera. "Oh mio Dio, Dante, I told you. I told you she was wonderful. She has teeth, this one. Not like the others." Dante did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood there, absolutely still, his obsidian eyes locked onto Nora's with an intensity that would have made most people take a physical step backward. But Nora did not step back. She had grown up under the gaze of a Marine drill instructor. She could stand her ground against a mafia prince. Slowly, so slowly it was almost surgical, something shifted behind Dante's eyes. The dismissive disdain evaporated. In its place appeared something far more dangerous. Interest. Recalibration. The hungry, focused stillness of a predator that had just discovered the small, apparently helpless creature in front of it was not helpless at all. "You speak Italian," Dante said finally, in English now. His voice was quieter than before, and somehow more menacing for it. "Fluently." "I speak 7 languages fluently, Mr. Ferrari," Nora replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Italian, French, Arabic, Farsi, Spanish, Portuguese, and the language of grown men who apologize when they have been rude. Perhaps you can practice the last one with me." Isabella laughed so hard she started to cough, and Nora immediately turned back to her patient, pouring her a glass of water and rubbing gentle circles on her back until the coughing eased. She did not look at Dante again. She did not need to. She could feel his eyes on her, tracking every movement of her hands, every gentle adjustment she made to his grandmother's shawl. She could feel him reassessing her from the ground up. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, sensible voice was reminding her that she had just publicly humiliated a man who almost certainly killed people for a living. She ignored it. She had a patient to care for. Isabella needed her medication logged, her vitals rechecked, and her dinner tray coordinated with the kitchen staff. Dante Ferrari and his wounded pride would simply have to wait. Nora poured herself into her work with the steady, unhurried competence of a professional who refused to be rattled. But she was aware, painfully aware, that Dante had not left the room. He had walked instead to the sliding glass doors at the far end of the sunroom, pulled a slim black phone from his pocket, and stepped out onto the wide marble balcony that overlooked the entire glittering length of Central Park. He stood there in profile against the darkening sky, one hand in his pocket, the phone pressed to his ear, speaking in rapid, low Italian to someone on the other end. Nora glanced up once, only once, and caught the sharp cut of his silhouette against the city lights. And in that exact moment, 42 floors up and across the avenue, on the rooftop of a building that had been carefully chosen for its sight line, a professional sniper exhaled slowly and began to squeeze the trigger. Nora had just finished logging Isabella's evening medication when something at the edge of her vision made her hands go still. It was not a sound. It was not a movement. It was a color, a single impossible cherry-red pinpoint of light, sliding across the pale fabric of Dante Ferrari's collar as he stood on the balcony with his back to the room. For half a heartbeat, her brain refused to name it. Some part of her, the civilian part, the part that had spent the day charting vital signs and adjusting for drips, tried to convince her it was a reflection, a trick of the chandelier, a laser pointer from a child in the building across the way. But the trained part of her, the part her Marine father had built like a fortress inside her chest, recognized that dot for exactly what it was in a fraction of a second. A laser sight, steady, rising, climbing from the center of Dante's back up the line of his spine toward the base of his skull. She had watched enough combat footage sitting on her father's living room floor as a teenager to know the truth. If you saw the dot, you were already too late. Unless you moved. Now, Nora did not think. Nora ran. She dropped the medication chart. She dropped every polite instinct that told a nurse not to touch a patient's family without permission. She launched herself out of the chair and across the sunroom floor at a full sprint, her generous curves carrying momentum like a freight train that had jumped its tracks. Isabella cried out behind her in surprise. The 2 guards in the hallway turned toward the sound. But Nora was already at the sliding glass doors, already shouldering through them, already screaming a single word at the top of her lungs. Down. Dante Ferrari began to turn. He was a man whose survival instincts had been forged in 20 years of underworld warfare, and even the unexpected sound of a woman screaming behind him was enough to trigger a reflexive pivot. But he was not fast enough. Nothing human was fast enough. In the last fraction of a second before the sniper's round crossed 42 floors of empty Manhattan air, Nora Whitfield slammed her entire body into the center of Dante's back, with every ounce of force her frame could generate. 200 pounds of trained purposeful nurse meeting 190 pounds of unprepared mafia prince at full speed. The impact drove them both forward. The reinforced glass wall behind Dante detonated in the exact same instant, a supersonic round punching through the panel, with a sound like a whip crack in the sky. Fragments of glass rained across the balcony in a glittering silver shower. Dante's crystal bourbon glass exploded against the stone railing. And Nora, in the split second between impact and landing, did something that would haunt Dante for the rest of his life. She twisted her body midair. She wrapped one arm around the back of his head to cradle it. She took the marble floor with her own left side. Her ribs hit the stone with the sickening percussive clarity of dry branches snapping under a boot. 1, 2, 3. She heard them break before she felt them. And then the pain arrived, white and blinding and enormous, radiating out from her side in waves so intense that for one terrible moment she thought her lung had collapsed on impact. Somewhere far above her, a second round ricocheted off the railing with a metallic scream and buried itself in the ceiling. Dante was moving before the second shot finished echoing. He rolled, dragging Nora with him behind the low stone lip of the balcony wall, shielding her body with his own in a single fluid motion that spoke of a man who had survived more than one ambush in his life. His guards exploded onto the balcony half a second later, submachine guns already drawn, one of them barking rapid orders into an encrypted earpiece. Sniper, West Building, 42nd floor, get the roof team on the phone now. Get the boss inside, move. Hands grabbed Nora under her arms and began to lift her. She cried out. The pain in her ribs was so severe that black spots bloomed at the edges of her vision. And then Dante's voice cut through everything, low and sharp and absolutely final. Do not touch her like that. Get a stretcher. Now. The hands released her instantly. Someone shouted for medical. Someone else was already on the phone with a private trauma physician on the Ferrari payroll. Dante himself was crouched over her, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other pressed gently but firmly against her sternum to keep her still. Do not move, nurse, he said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something raw and unfamiliar even to him. Do not move. Help is coming. Look at me. Stay with me. Nora forced her eyes to focus on his face. He was inches from her, so close she could see the tiny fragments of glass caught in his dark hair. So close she could see the pale line of the old scar at the corner of his jaw. So close she could see, unmistakably, the shock in his obsidian eyes. She drew in a shallow, careful breath, and even that small movement sent lightning through her side. And then, because she was Nora Whitfield and she was a trauma nurse before she was anything else, she began to speak in the calm, clinical voice she used with her most critical patients. Left lateral rib fractures, she said quietly, her words measured and precise. Ribs 6, 7, and 8, based on the location of the pain. Possible pleural involvement. I am not spitting blood, so lung parenchyma is likely intact for now, but I need chest imaging within the hour and a decompression kit standing by in case I develop a pneumothorax. Do not let anyone move me without a rigid backboard. My airway is clear. My pulse feels tachycardic, but strong. I am not going into shock yet. I am not your emergency, Mr. Ferrari. I am your patient. Now get me somewhere with a portable ultrasound, and I will tell you exactly what is wrong with me. Dante Ferrari stared down at the woman lying broken on his balcony, the woman who had just saved his life at the cost of her own bones, the woman who was now calmly diagnosing herself with the same detached professionalism she had used to log his grandmother's blood pressure 10 minutes earlier. And something inside his chest, something that had been sealed shut for 15 years behind layers of scar tissue and violence and control, cracked open with a sound only he could hear. He leaned down until his forehead almost touched hers. His voice, when it finally came, was little more than a rasp. Nora Whitfield, he said, you are going to live. And when you are healed, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about what you have just done to me. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. Somewhere closer, boots pounded up marble stairs. And Nora, exhausted and bleeding and burning with pain, allowed herself one small, defiant smile before the darkness finally rose up to claim her. Nora surfaced from unconsciousness in slow, drifting layers, the way a diver rises through deep water. The first thing she registered was the steady, rhythmic beep of a cardiac monitor to her left. The second was the cool, controlled hiss of oxygen through a nasal cannula. The third was the dull, tightly wrapped ache in her left side that told her someone had already stabilized her rib fractures, inserted a small chest drain as a precaution, and started her on a carefully titrated morphine drip. She did not need to open her eyes to know she was not in a hospital. Hospitals smelled of industrial disinfectant and cafeteria food and stress. This room smelled of cedarwood, fresh linen, and something faintly floral, like white jasmine. When she finally forced her eyelids open, she found herself lying in a wide four-poster bed in a room that looked more like a suite at the Ritz than a recovery ward. Cream walls, heavy silk drapes drawn against the morning light, a polished walnut side table stacked with medical monitors that would have cost a public hospital its annual budget. And sitting in a leather wing chair 3 feet from her bed, still wearing the same black shirt from the night before, sleeves still rolled to his elbows, forearms still streaked with dried blood that Nora slowly realized was her own, was Dante Ferrari. He had not slept. She could see it in the darkness beneath his obsidian eyes and the fine tension in his jaw. On the other side of the room, Isabella Ferrari sat in a wheelchair with a rosary threaded through her weathered fingers, murmuring soft, unbroken Italian prayers beneath her breath. When Nora stirred, both of them turned toward her at the same time. Isabella let out a small, joyful sob and reached for her hand. Dante simply leaned forward and said, in a voice hoarse from a long night of silence, "You should not have done that." Nora managed a small, crooked smile. Her lips were dry, and her throat felt like sandpaper, but her mind was sharp enough. "You are welcome," she rasped back. He almost laughed. Almost. Instead he stood, poured her a small cup of water from a crystal pitcher, and held the straw to her lips with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with the man who had ordered his guards to lock down a penthouse the night before. Isabella squeezed her hand and whispered in Italian, "You saved my grandson, cara mia. There is no debt in this family that will ever be greater than what you have given us." Then, with the wisdom of a woman who had been married to a mafia patriarch for 50 years, she wheeled herself politely out of the room and closed the door behind her, leaving Nora and Dante alone. Loving the story so far? Hit that like button, subscribe for more mafia romance stories, and let me know the city you're watching from in the comments. Dante did not sit back down. He walked slowly to the foot of the bed and stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at Nora the way a general might look at a map that had rearranged itself overnight into an entirely new country. "The sniper was a professional," he said quietly. "Contract work. We traced the rifle back to a Belgian arms dealer within 4 hours. The shooter himself is currently a guest in a very unpleasant basement in Newark. He was hired by a rival family, the Castellanos. They have been trying to remove me from this earth for the last 18 months. Nora watched his face as he spoke, noting the flat, controlled way he described a man being tortured for information. She did not flinch. She had spent too many nights holding pressure on gunshot wounds in the Bronx to be shocked by the machinery of organized violence. "And what does any of that," she asked carefully, "have to do with me?" Dante's eyes finally met hers again, and this time there was no mask on his face. Only truth. "The Castellanos will have watched the security footage of last night by now," he said. "They will have seen a woman throw herself between me and a bullet. They will not believe you were a private duty nurse who happened to be in the wrong penthouse at the wrong moment. They will assume you were part of my personal security detail. And that means, from this morning forward, they will consider you a legitimate target." Nora went very still. The steady beep of the cardiac monitor picked up its pace by 10 beats a minute. Dante watched the numbers climb and did not look away. "My mother," Nora said, her voice suddenly tight. "My sister. My mother lives in Brooklyn. My sister is a sophomore at NYU. She lives in the dorms on 3rd Avenue. Dante reached into his jacket and produced a slim, black tablet. He unlocked it with a fingerprint and slid it gently across the bedsheets into her uninjured hand. Nora looked down at the screen. There was live surveillance footage playing on it, split into 3 panels. The first showed a black sedan parked directly across the street from her apartment building in Astoria. 2 men in dark jackets seated inside it, one of them clearly holding a long-lens camera. The second showed her mother's small brick townhouse in Brooklyn, and a man in a gray hoodie sitting on the bench directly opposite the front door, pretending to read a newspaper that he had not once turned a page of. The third showed her younger sister, Emma, walking to a 9 o'clock class with her earbuds in and her backpack slung over one shoulder, entirely unaware of the man in a black baseball cap trailing her at a distance of exactly half a block. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. She looked up at Dante with something dangerously close to fury. "You are not doing this," she said, her voice shaking. "You are not going to sit there and tell me my family is in danger because I stopped a bullet from going through your head. That is not how the world works. That is not how any of this works." Dante did not argue. He simply took the tablet gently from her hand, set it aside, and pulled the leather chair closer to the bed until he was sitting directly beside her. "I did not put those men there, Nora," he said. His voice was low and steady and did not carry a single note of self-defense. "I would give anything if I could tell you I had, because then I could call them off with a single phone call. But those men belong to a family that has already tried to kill me 6 times in 18 months. They will not stop because you ask them politely. They will only stop when someone with the authority to make them stop steps between them and the people they intend to hurt. And on this island, in this borough, on this exact block, there is only one person alive with that kind of authority. And you are looking at him." He waited. He let her feel the full weight of it. He did not soften it or dress it up in gentler language. Nora closed her eyes. She thought about her mother, 63 years old, walking to the corner bodega for her morning coffee. She thought about Emma, 20 years old, laughing with her roommates over cheap dorm coffee. She thought about her own tiny apartment in Astoria, where she had painted the walls a soft sage green last spring because it made her feel calm after long shifts. And she thought about how quickly, how obscenely quickly, all of it could be taken away. When she opened her eyes again, she looked directly at Dante Ferrari and said, "One condition. You never lie to me. Not about the danger. Not about your business. Not about what you have done or what you are going to do. If I am going to sit in the middle of this storm with you, I am going to sit in it with my eyes open." Dante extended his hand. His palm was warm, calloused, and steadier than any hand she had ever shaken in her life. "On my grandmother's life, Nora Whitfield," he said quietly, "I will never lie to you." And when she placed her hand in his, something quiet and permanent shifted in the space between them, the way tectonic plates shift beneath a city that has no idea its map is being rewritten beneath its feet. 2 weeks became 4. 4 weeks became 8. Nora healed slowly under the care of the private physician Dante kept on retainer, and in that time the walls of the estate stopped feeling like a cage and started feeling like something closer to a sanctuary. Dante was a constant, unhurried presence at her side. He brought her books in 3 languages. He sat quietly in the leather chair beside her bed while she slept off pain medication. He walked her carefully through the estate's rose gardens when her ribs were strong enough to allow it, matching his long stride to her cautious pace without a single word of complaint. And in those slow sunlit afternoons, he learned things about her that he had never learned about any other woman in his life. He learned that she had once been engaged to an anesthesiologist named Preston Wexler, who had spent 2 years of their relationship suggesting she consider weight loss surgery. He learned that she had ended it the night Preston told her she would photograph better for the hospital gala if she skipped dinner for a month. He learned that she had not dated seriously in 3 years, not because she was afraid, but because she refused to shrink herself for anyone ever again. And Dante Ferrari, a man who had spent 15 years using words like weapons, said the only words that mattered. "There is nothing about you that needs to be smaller, Nora. Your body saved my life. Your mind challenges mine. Your mouth ruined me from the first sentence you spoke in Italian. Preston is a fool. And if I ever meet him, I will explain that to him in a way he will understand for the rest of his natural life. She almost believed he was joking. Almost. 6 weeks into her recovery, the war she had walked into finally ended. Dante did not end it with bloodshed. He ended it the way he ended most things, with surgical precision. He fed a carefully curated ledger of Castellano financial crimes to a federal prosecutor who had been building a RICO case for 3 years. He froze offshore accounts through a chain of shell companies that could not be traced back to him. He allowed 2 Castellano capos to be arrested at JFK on their way to the Cayman Islands. And when the dust settled, 3 of the men who had ordered her family surveilled were facing 40-year federal sentences, and the rest of the Castellano leadership had quietly, unanimously agreed that a truce with the Ferrari family was very much in everyone's interest. Nora's mother came home to Brooklyn. Emma went back to her dorm at NYU. And Nora, for the first time in 2 months, walked out of the Ferrari estate as a free woman. She did not stay free for long. Not because Dante forced her hand, but because she chose not to. She moved into a beautiful pre-war apartment on the Upper West Side that Dante had bought without ever asking her, because he had known, with the quiet certainty of a man who had waited 15 years to be sure of anything, that she would eventually say yes. She opened a private trauma clinic on the ground floor of a Ferrari-owned building in Harlem, staffed by 3 of the best surgeons in the state, serving both his organization's people and uninsured patients from the surrounding community for free. It had been her one non-negotiable condition. She would keep practicing medicine. He would keep her safe while she did it. They compromised, the way 2 stubborn people in love inevitably do, and the result was the happiest either of them had ever been. Isabella officially adopted Nora as family at a small Sunday dinner attended by 4 generations of Ferraris, kissing her on both cheeks and whispering in Italian that the Madonna herself had sent her. The last piece of the past resolved itself on a cold October evening at a charity gala benefiting the trauma unit at Mount Sinai. Nora arrived on Dante's arm in a custom crimson silk gown designed by a Milanese house that dressed European royalty. It hugged every generous curve of her body, without apology. A necklace of vintage rubies and diamonds, borrowed from the Ferrari family vault, glittered at her throat. Her dark hair was pinned into a low chignon. Her lips wore the same berry stain she had worn the night she saved his life. She looked, and knew she looked, like a woman who had rewritten her own definition of beautiful. Preston Wexler, M.D., spotted her from across the ballroom and made the mistake of approaching. He stammered a compliment. He said something about how well she looked. He said something about how he had always known she had potential. Dante stepped forward before Nora had to respond, extended his hand in a handshake that was not really a handshake, and leaned in close enough to Preston's ear that no one else could hear. "Doctor," Dante said quietly, "you once told this woman she needed to be smaller. Take a very good look at how large her life has become without you. Now walk away, and do not ever speak her name in public again." Preston walked away shaking, so hard he spilled his champagne on his own shoes. Nora watched him go, then turned to Dante and said only, "You promised me you would never lie to me." Did that count as a threat or a warning? Dante lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed a slow kiss to her knuckles. It counted as a fact, Mia Regina. Facts are neither threats nor warnings. Facts are simply what happens next. 3 months later, on a clear December night with snow drifting lazily past the Manhattan skyline, Dante Ferrari led Nora out onto the newly rebuilt balcony where a bullet had once nearly ended his life. The glass was reinforced now, 3 inches thick and rated against military-grade rounds. A discreet team of security operatives stood at every corner of the roof. But Dante did not seem to notice any of it. He was looking at her the way he had been looking at her since the moment she had regained consciousness in his guest suite 2 months earlier, as though she were the only fact in the universe that mattered. He reached into the pocket of his charcoal suit jacket, dropped slowly and deliberately to one knee on the same marble where her ribs had shattered 8 months before, and held up a small platinum ring set with an emerald-cut diamond that had belonged to his great-grandmother. "You gave me 3 ribs, Nora Whitfield," he said quietly, his voice carrying only as far as her ears. You gave me your breath and your bones and your body when a stranger's bullet came for my life. I have spent every day since then trying to think of something worthy to give you in return, and I have finally accepted that there is nothing in my possession that is equal to what you did for me. So I'm going to give you everything I have instead. Every building, every dollar, every heartbeat left in this body, every language I speak, and every language I will learn just to hear you correct my pronunciation. Marry me, not because I saved your family, not because you saved my life. Marry me because I have loved you since the first sentence you spoke in Italian, and I intend to love you until the last sentence I ever speak in any language at all. Nora, who had spent her entire adult life being told she was too much of one thing and not enough of another, knelt down slowly on the marble beside him. She cupped his face in both hands. She looked into the obsidian eyes that had once catalogued her like a piece of furniture, and now looked at her like she had personally hung the stars over Manhattan. "Yes," she whispered, "but if anyone ever shoots at you again, Dante Ferrari, you are taking the hit yourself. My ribs are officially retired." He laughed, really laughed, and then he kissed her under the falling snow, on the balcony where a plus-size nurse had once run toward a bullet, and became the queen of an empire built on loyalty, protection, and the kind of love that only comes from someone who is willing to break their own bones to keep you breathing. If Nora's courage and Dante's devotion gave you chills, smash that like button. Subscribe for more mafia romance stories, and tell me the city you're watching from in the comments below.